Welcome friends to a versus battle between the Mazda CX-50 and the Mazda CX-5. There seems to be a lot of confusion between these two SUVs, so in this video I hope to clear up a lot of the doubts and the questions that many shoppers might have. The first thing I want to get out of the way is the CX-50 is riding upon its own unique platform. The CX-50 is also not going to replace the CX-5. Both the CX-5 and the CX-50, they will both be sold in a dealership together, side by side, so both SUVs will coexist with each other. However, with the CX-50, Mazda wanted to create an SUV specifically for the United States market, and that is why it exists. Because it's made for the United States market, they had trails in mind, they had camping in mind, some slight off-roading. In fact, this is supposed to be the most off-road, most off-road ready Mazda that's ever been made before. Because if you look at the Mazda lineup, the rest of the SUVs and the sedans and all that, they're all kind of urban type vehicles meant for city driving, and that's what the CX-5 is. However, the CX-50 is trying to deviate from that and it's trying to do its own little off-road thing. But don't get this confused with like a Jeep Wrangler, a Bronco, a Land Rover, or a Lexus LX, because the CX-50 is meant to do light off-roading, trails, gravel, things like that. Okay, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and let's talk about the exterior first, because that's a drastic change between the two. I personally really like the way the CX-50 looks. I think it's aggressive. It has a more squared off appearance to it. Almost reminds me of the new Acura MDX, in fact. However, I've heard that many people don't like that black plastic cladding with the CX-50, and I can certainly see that and I can certainly understand that. Surprisingly for me, it's actually not a big deal. I actually think they did a pretty good job implementing it into the design of the overall vehicle, but obviously styling is subjective. The one good thing about the CX-5 is you can get a more top trim level CX-5 and you can actually get rid of the black plastic cladding on the CX-5 completely, whereas you cannot do that with the CX-50. The plastic cladding is going to be there. It's to help differentiate itself and to let you know it's more off-road capable, right? So that's why that's there. Anyway, from a size comparison standpoint, the CX-50 is a bit longer by a little over 5 inches. It's got a 185.8 inch long length, total length, and the CX-5 is around 180.1 inches. Now the wheelbase is also longer on the CX-50 as well by about 4 inches. It is 110.8 inches compared to the CX-5 wheelbase at 106.2 inches. And like you would expect, the ground clearance is also higher on the CX-50. It's around 8.6 inches, and this can deviate by like 1/10 of an inch depending on the different trim levels. But it's about 8.6 inches for the CX-50 and approximately 7.9 inches for the CX-5. So that's pretty much a coverage of the exterior. Let me know which one you like the looks of the most. However, I want to let you know there is certainly a price difference between the two. The CX-50 obviously costs a little bit more money. It's not much at the lower end. It's maybe like $1,000 more than the CX-5 when you compare to the more base model trims. However, once you step it up to the fully loaded turbo models, then the price difference is much higher, like a few grand actually, and it gets even more expensive once you start tacking on the Meridian package, the Apex editions and all that stuff for the CX-50. That's going to be the more off-road looking CX-50, right, with the 18-inch wheels, the Falcon, all-terrain tires, a little roof rack. That's what the Apex and the Meridian packages are for the CX-50. Once you tack all that on, yeah, it's several $1,000s more than the turbo signature model of the CX-5, just so you know. Next, I want to talk about the engines, because you have the same exact engine options with both of them. You have a non-turbocharged, naturally aspirated 4-cylinder engine producing 187 horsepower and 186 pounds-feet of torque, and that's with regular fuel. There is no benefit to those horsepower and torque figures when you use premium. However, with the turbo engines, which both vehicles can be optioned with a turbocharged engine, that will produce 256 horsepower and 320 pounds-feet of torque. And that's on premium 93 octane. However, you can use 87 octane with both of these vehicles with their turbo engine options, but that will lower your horsepower and your torque to 227 horsepower and 310 pounds-feet of torque. Now, there is another difference between these two, and that's going to be with the towing figures. The CX-50 can tow up to 3,500 pounds when equipped with that turbocharged engine. However, the CX-5 can only tow up to 2,000 pounds even with the turbocharged engine, just so you know. Another interesting thing to note, the fuel economy figures. With the naturally aspirated 4-cylinder, they're both the same with all-wheel drive, of course. That's another thing I forgot to mention. With both the CX-5 and the CX-50, they are offering all-wheel drive as standard, so no more front-wheel drive CX-5s, none of that. Even the base model will come with all-wheel drive, which I believe is a good thing. Anyway, that's going to get you 24 in the city and 30 on the highway with that naturally aspirated 4-cylinder. However, with the turbocharged engine, with the CX-50, it is rated to get 23 in the city and 29 on the highway, whereas the turbocharged CX-5 only does 22 in the city and 27 out on the highway. I thought that was kind of funny because the CX-50 also weighs a little bit more than the CX-5. It's about 40 pounds more. Now, both vehicles will come with the Mazda Intelligent Drive Select, so you will get your sport and your off-road modes with both. However, with the turbocharged CX-50, you will also get a towing mode as well, whereas the Turbo CX-5 does not get a towing mode. Both SUVs still utilize the same 6-speed automatic transmission. The CX-50 does get slightly more upgraded brakes. It gets a 12.8-inch rotor in the front and a 12.8-inch rotor in the back, whereas a turbocharged CX-5 will get a 12.6-inch rotor in the front and a 11.9-inch solid disc rotor in the back. And that's for the turbo models. The turning circle is identical with both. You get a 36-foot curb-to-curb turning circle diameter. However, one of the biggest changes between both, it's going to be with the rear suspension. The front suspension is the same. They both utilize a McPherson strut suspension in the front. However, the rear is where it changes. The CX-5 utilizes a multi-link rear suspension, but the CX-50 utilizes a torsion beam rear suspension. Now, what does that mean to the everyday shopper? Well, in layman's terms, the multi-link suspension is a superior suspension geometry compared to a torsion beam, which is a lot more simplistic and cheaper to produce. However, Mazda says that they had a good reason for going with the torsion beam rear suspension on the CX-50, and that's because since the CX-50 has this off-road duty to fulfill, they utilize that torsion beam to help keep a more level and planted ride when going over gravel or dirt roads. So despite a multi-link being a superior suspension setup and architecture, they decided to go with a more simplistic torsion beam setup because that's what they claim. They claim that it's going to give you less of that jostling effect, less of that movement when you go over bumps or dirt roads, if you will. That's fine. I believe them. That's cool, because in reality, even though we went through all these specs, right? How do both of these vehicles drive out on the street? Both of these SUVs feel identical to drive. This torsion beam rear suspension does not bother me one bit. It feels and handles identical to the CX-5. The ride quality is the same. The handling is the same. Usually with the torsion beam rear suspension, it's going to ride worse for the rear passengers. It's going to feel a little bit more bouncy in the rear. However, that was not the case when I tested out the CX-50. They both rode extremely well. They're both about as quiet. They feel pretty much identical in terms of how quick they are. I will say, despite the CX-50 getting slightly better brakes, I feel like the braking performance on both are pretty much the same, and that means they are both average. I feel like Mazda could improve the braking performance of these SUVs, but everything else is pretty much fantastic, and both of these SUVs handle the same. One thing to note, the CX-50 does have a slightly larger fuel tank at 15.9 gallons versus the 15.3 gallon fuel tank on the CX-5. But that's pretty much everything you need to know regarding driving the CX-5 and the CX-50, their performance, etc. Now let's move on to the interior space, because the interior size and everything is also almost identical between both of these SUVs, which is actually kind of a shame because the CX-50 does have that longer wheelbase, about 4 inches longer compared to the CX-5. However, the rear legroom has not increased by 4 inches or anything like that. In fact, it's like a few tenths of an inch longer in terms of rear legroom compared to a CX-5. However, the CX-5 has a couple tenths of an inch more headroom compared to the CX-50. So they're pretty much identical. They're pretty much the same in terms of the dimensions of the interior cabin. Design-wise, I've noticed that the CX-50 has like vertical air vents, but that's pretty much it. The infotainment is the same, excellent infotainment between both. Same thing with the gauge cluster. All that is the same. The technology is great. I appreciate that. But I did notice that with the Bose audio system, you actually get a 12-speaker Bose audio with the CX-50 versus the 10-speaker found in the CX-5. To my ear, they both sound identical, but just thought I would let you know about that. Now, another difference is going to be with the seats. They both have extremely comfortable, nice seats. However, with the CX-5 Turbo Signature, the fully loaded model, you get these really nice, true Napa leather seats. With the CX-50, you don't get that option. However, I have noticed that they are giving you a terracotta leather option, but I just think that's a different color, a more beige tan leather option. It's not a true Napa leather, I don't think, but comment below, let me know if the terracotta is a different seat material. I don't think it is. I think it's just a different color. If that matters to you, a fully loaded CX-5 does come with true Napa leather seats, so that is going to be a difference between the two, but both are extremely comfortable. Both are great, non-fatiguing seats, not an issue. But the trunk is a slight difference, and it's kind of interesting the way this works out. So according to Mazda, the CX-50 has a slightly larger trunk, and it does seem that way in person. It has a 31.4 cubic foot cargo capacity in the trunk of the CX-50 versus a 29.1 cubic feet cargo capacity in the CX-5 trunk. So almost 2 cubic feet more with the CX-50, but that's with the seats up. When you put the seats down, then the CX-5 gets the advantage. The CX-5 has a 58.1 cubic feet amount of space when you have the rear seats down. However, the CX-50 only has a 56.3 cubic feet capacity with the seats down. I just thought that was interesting. Regardless, the CX-50 is the larger vehicle, physically has a longer wheelbase and everything, but really they were able to design the CX-50 the way they wanted it for the United States market, because they didn't have to restrict themselves and make a smaller vehicle than they needed to, because the CX-5 is sold in other parts of the world as well, where other countries might have smaller roads, things like that, whereas the CX-50 will only be made for the United States. So they had more freedom in its design and the looks. But regarding the interior space, both of these SUVs ended up being almost identical with each other. But hopefully you found value with this in-depth versus coverage of both the CX-5 and the CX-50. Let me know if there's something that I missed, or if there's something that you wanted me to cover and I forgot to cover it here. Let me know in the comment section. But I have done a full review on both of these vehicles. I will have them on the end screens here. Check them out and I will see you there.